We are back on the record in the Duke Energy IRP case, and all commissioners are now present. All parties in the courtroom that were here earlier are here virtually. Just to double check, I want to make sure. Ms. Eaton, are you there? Mr. Burns, you're there.
I'm here.
Okay, thank you very much. And I see Ms. Clancy's here as well, and Mr. Gooding. So we will continue with commissioner questions. First, let me thank you all for your indulgence. And hopefully now we can get this thing moving on and get it done. Commissioner Caston, you had the floor, and if you want to continue with your questions.
Thank you. Actually, that was going to be my last question, but it created others. The current South Carolina law has no carbon restrictions, correct?
Not explicitly. I would say without carbon restrictions of some sort, you don't meet what we demonstrated with P0 is you don't meet the balancing factors. So to put a P0 in with no carbon, then but it does not have an explicit word of carbon restriction in it.
Okay. And Mr. Quintos, if I understood it correctly from the question and answers too, Duke ran models that produced 53 portfolios. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In Duke's supplemental plan, the summary only presented 3 portfolios. Is that correct?
We presented 7 portfolios in the supplemental planning analysis.
Right, but as far as the base, did you consider that 3 base portfolios, P1, P2, P3?
We provided supplemental updates to each of the 3 base portfolios. So P1 base, P2 base, and P3 base all were updated. We also updated the P0 no carbon constraints portfolio in the supplemental planning analysis.
Okay. But relative to like P1, P2, and P3, they were all constrained by North Carolina carbon emission restrictions, correct?
They all included a trajectory for reducing exposure to CO2 emissions, with the exception of this no CO2 constraint one.
But that's a yes, correct?
Yes, that is.
Okay. I want you to answer it fully, but feel free not to use any more words than you need to also, but answer fully. That's fine. Relative to models, this model, really any model, but this model is the one we're talking about. Do inputs and constraints affect the model outcomes?
Yes.
Do model outputs vary depending on the constraints used in the model?
They can, not always. For example, if you don't hit we may put a annual cap or limitation on how much a resource can select, and if it doesn't select up to that, it's a non-binding constraint and therefore didn't really have an impact.
I understand. Depending on the inputs and constraints used in the model, could the model produce a resource plan that complies with the Clean Air Act, Section 111 final rule, without carbon constraints?
Yes.
Would this affect the near-term action plan?
It would likely drive a different set of resources. I think the near-term action plan that the companies have put forward does robustly address the set of resources, but to the extent that a different portfolio had a different set of resources that still would be able to meet those balancing factors, then the actions you may take in the near term may be different.
You're talking about the balancing factors in South Carolina's IRP?
Yes, I am.
Including the affordability and least cost?
Yes.
Okay. That's all I have for right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Caston. Any further commissioner questions? Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Morning, Commissioner.
Um, Mr. Snyder, I think my first question will be for you. When the proceedings started last week, there were some comments made by Attorney Trawick, and it related to I believe he said something like, we're not asking for approval for any cost recovery of any dollars. And I would like to get you to kind of put that in your own words, if you could.
Yes, sir, Commissioner. We list dollars in the plan just to give the commission transparency as to these are estimates, so it certainly isn't a firm dollar. It's here's the steps we need to take to develop the resources that are in the plan, and each of the different resources have different steps we need to take in the near-term action plan. And for some of those, what we're just trying to do is say, here's a series of activities that are involved in pre-development, and here's a rough estimate of the general dollars that are involved. We certainly understand as a company, we're not asking you to approve those dollars or give us pre-approval on those dollars, but rather that this set of activities that we're undertaking, given what we know today, is prudent and in the interest of South Carolina customers. And so what we tried to do there is just provide transparency to the best of our ability. But yes, I agree with Mr. Trawick's initial assessment that we certainly aren't asking for any form of pre-approval of those dollars, and understand that that will take place in a future proceeding depending on the scope of the dollars, whether it's a general rate case or a fuel case or an EEDSM rider or a CPRE. You know, there's a series of future proceedings that will be coming forward on those.
Okay. And so I have some questions. There's been talk about the two companies coming together, the Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress, and there's been mention of the benefits of being one big company and no distinction between the states. And I kind of just have some questions about the distinction between the states. And the reason that I'm wondering about this is that there are definitely some differences in state law now that were not differences just a few years ago. And obviously the carbon reduction rules would be one, and the pre-approval of dollars would be another. And it, you know, from all of what's being discussed here, it's like there are a lot of assets in North Carolina that are not really in good favor with North Carolina law. It's basically time to phase the coal plants out, and that there's movement to the the Bad Creek pump storage in South Carolina, as well as South Carolina obviously has a lot of nuclear. And I'm just wondering, would it be appropriate, since time and money is being spent on combining the two companies, would it be appropriate to have or take a look at dividing by state? And I keep hearing reasons not to, and just like see what you have to say about that.
Yeah, that haven't heard this a little bit of, over the course, not just of this week, but in the past. You've got existing resources, and then you've got this portfolio of new resources that we're recommending, or that any of the portfolios have. No matter what portfolio we end up, there's a lot of new resources that are needed for growth. It would be, in my mind, and I'm not aware of any precedent, not to say that I would know for sure, but to divide all the historic resources up would be extraordinarily complex in my mind. And you sort of have the regulatory policy end of things, the legal end of things. You got FERC, you know, a merger. Bringing utilities together takes states and the federal government to agree. Now, splitting them up, I'm assuming, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to pretend to know what would be involved, but there's sort of the legal regulatory end of that, of how would you even do that and what are all the approvals. You have NERC requirements, FERC requirements on your transmission. Operating wise, you know, how would you go about operating those units that have been in service for decades, that have been committed and dispatched in a way to serve the broader footprint? So once you move past the legal regulatory policy into operation space, I think it would be, you're talking, and again, not speaking for Mr. Holman, but you know, if you were two separate entities with two different sets of assets, you would need, you know, probably two different operation centers and operating rooms, and you know, you would lose all those, if it was even possible, you would lose those economies and efficiencies from joint commitment and joint dispatch of the units. So I don't see a path to have historic and new assets all, you know, be sort of unmerged, if you will. It seems like, given to Mr. Quinto's earlier point, given how much overlap there is in the law, to work diligently to find a plan that works for both states, and where there is limited exceptions, find ways to deal with those limited exceptions. I think that has been more the national precedent, is where there is multi-state jurisdictions and there's differences between the states, that they isolate those differences, minimize them to the extent possible, and then deal with those isolated differences. So I apologize for the long-winded answer, but I don't know of any examples where a system the size of our system has been, after the fact, divvied up and put into two different entities, one for each state.
Well, I mean, it definitely is a long history of being two-state. I think, if I remember correctly, the company was founded on the Catawba River, and basically from the very beginning was sending power to North Carolina and South Carolina. So are there, is Duke have two-state or multi-state operations anywhere else in terms of regulated utilities?
Florida's its own entity unto itself. Then there's Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, but to my knowledge, those all operate independently. Mr. Quinto used to spend some time on Midwest modeling. I'll confirm with him, but to my knowledge, they're all independent states in terms of the Duke utilities.
How about you, Mr. Quinto? Do you know what goes on in those other states in terms of multi-state operations or not?
I'm not very familiar. I know that Duke Energy Kentucky does have an asset that sits in Ohio. I'm not sure how that works from a multi-state jurisdictional perspective, but that's my recollection.
Yeah, I was thinking that there was one that had a little bit of overlap, but don't remember which ones, and it just seemed like I heard something about if you make a decision in this state, then it controls the other state. But
yeah, unfortunately, I'm not the right person to answer that. Maybe Ms. Bateman can give more perspective on how that's done across the country.
okay, I think that's all I have for right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Thomas. Any further commissioner questions? Commissioner Williams?
I'm happy to yield to another commissioner, though, because I've had a bite at the apple. But go, Commissioner Williams.
Vice Chair Williams?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Good morning, gentlemen. How are you all doing today?
Good morning. Doing well.
Good morning.
Good. I have a couple of general questions that I welcome answers from anyone who feels equipped to answer the question. Would you agree with me that there appears to be some level of concern about the company's IRP complying with the carbon reduction rules in North Carolina?
Yeah, sitting obviously either in the room or listening to every minute of this last week, there certainly that's being raised. I think, what we're trying to convey, and I'm hoping we're being as articulate as we can, is that there's been a tremendous focus on the differences, which, if applied correctly, the two laws are not as different as you would think. Both say take reasonable steps. Both laws put reliability at the center. Both laws say minimize costs subject to constraints. The South Carolina law, when it says resource diversity should be considered, commodity price risk should be considered, being consistent with applicable state and federal laws, and in looking at foreseeable conditions. You simply cannot accomplish those without achieving carbon reductions, right? So you think about how we diversify a portfolio. Other than natural gas, every resource that goes into the resource plan is carbon free or reduces carbon. So small modular reactors reduce carbon. Wind reduces carbon. Solar reduces carbon. Storage, by default, reduces carbon because even if you're charging and discharging with gas, you're charging with more efficient, lower carbon gas, and you're discharging with less efficient, higher carbon intensive gas or coal. So every single balancing factor is achieved through carbon reduction. And when it says foreseeable conditions, I spoke earlier about carrots and sticks. Federal law for the last several years, I won't say, probably last decade or more, has been putting forward a series of carrots and sticks that favor lower carbon resources and penalize higher carbon resources. So when putting together a resource plan that envisions foreseeable conditions, you are talking really about lowering your exposure to carbon, because that's where the foreseeable conditions at the federal level have been for a decade. And so when I look at the two laws, and I look at them a lot, I see more commonality than I see differences. And I think Mr. Quinto said that earlier as well. And so specific to South Carolina, I don't envy the position of you're given, this commission, the company as well, a set of balancing factors that are not explicit, but that are qualitative in nature. And so when you say, have we achieved those balancing factors, there's going to maybe be a difference of opinion because they're not specific, whereas, North Carolina has a little bit more specific, get to 70%, but then they're also given a lot of discretion as to when and what resources and what's reasonable steps to do that. So they start quantitative, but then they have a lot of qualitative on the back end. And so we're looking here at a plan that we believe is looking at South Carolina by itself is squarely in line with South Carolina's law. And as I mentioned earlier, the fact that it produces a plan that is very, very similar to our peer utilities in the state who are not subject to North Carolina law is where some of that subjectivity goes away. I mean, if we truly were developing a plan that was only North Carolina law, or had too much of an emphasis on North Carolina law, how would we end up with a resource mix that was similar to our South Carolina peers and really peers up and down the Southeast? So we really do look at this, Vice Chair, as yes, there are differences in the law, but those differences are less than what has been made of, especially this last week. I think it doesn't behoove the parties to focus on the differences, but to look for commonality in the law, and starting with the stakeholder process and working through the modeling and then through discovery and hearings. I hope that as we go into our next one, that we can shift this focus more to where is a plan that squarely meets South Carolina's needs, but also complies with all federal and state laws in both jurisdictions. And I think we're really close. I mean, I think, in my mind, if we really step back and take a look, as I said earlier, I think we have a difference. What it appears is there's a difference in offshore wind. And potentially, I haven't really seen as much discussion on small modular reactors. But when we look at our near-term action plan, we certainly have time on both of those resources to drive further alignment as we go into our next comprehensive IRP. I apologize for the long-winded answer.
That's fine. And let me be clear, I'm unbothered by North Carolina's law. I can't speak for the rest of my colleagues. What I would want to know, and what I think South Carolina ratepayers would want to know, is whether or not they have to pay more, whether or not there's a bill impact, a higher, and let me be more specific, are they paying a higher bill monthly because of requirements in North Carolina? Obviously, no one would complain if it was a lower bill. They would be pro carbon reduction or North Carolina's plan, however you want to describe what's going on up there. And I'm not quite sure if that question has been answered. Does the company's requirement to meet North Carolina's law have a impact on their South Carolina ratepayers that cause them to pay more than they would if the company did not have to comply with North Carolina law? Can that question be answered?
I say it can be answered as, from my perspective, no, they're not being asked to pay more. Okay. Whenever you introduce constraints, so if we're going to put renewables in the plan that drive diversity of resources, that protect commodity price risk, if we're going to put storage in the plan relative to a pure P0, it is slightly higher. I mean, but the real question then is P0 consistent with South Carolina law? And so in my estimation, as we look at those balancing factors, and we put that 8 pages of South Carolina law and policy that Ms. Smith will talk about following this panel, it is not, right? So if your starting point is P0,
if you would
no, go ahead.
Indulge me by allowing me to interrupt you. You've said that a couple of times, that P0, in your opinion, is not in line with South Carolina law. Could you tell us why? Certainly,
and that is a good segue, because that's exactly where I was going. Is P0 has 53% of energy in the future coming from natural gas, and has it would have far less solar storage and alternate resources than our peer utilities, whose IRPs you have recently approved. And so we would be the least diverse, the most gas dependent, with the lowest level of solar of all, and then thinking towards foreseeable, you now have those assets for 35 years, and they're going to be subject to 35 years worth of increasing federal rules. And foreseeable conditions is in the eye of the beholder. But as I just laid out, there's a clear trend at the federal level, a series, as I call them, carrots and sticks that I don't see ending. And that has the greatest exposure to it. And so we would be outside the bands of our peer utilities. We would be going against the grain of federal laws. There is a pending, EPA is broke. One of the things that changed from the proposed rule to the existing rule, the final rules, they said, we're going to strip out existing gas from the rule. So when I say existing gas that's already in the ground, future regulations or restrictions or requirements on existing gas, they said, we're going to hold that. We're going to come out in November with rules on existing gas plants. And that's something we're going to have to factor into the next IRP. And I can tell you, it's not going to be more progressive. It's going to be more restrictive. So it's going to restrict in some form or fashion existing gas plants. And so with that as a backdrop, we really see P0, and not to mention that's all of the, we heard a lot about Mr. Stillman talked about in his direct, a lot of this manufacturing and data center load that's coming, they all are looking for jurisdictions that are being more diverse and have a path towards decarbonization. So we'd be out of step with where economic development is looking to site. And so for all of those reasons, I think when we look at P0, we say that is clearly not in line with South Carolina only. If that's the only thing I had to look at, it would not be in line with South Carolina's current IRP statute or the remainder of the policies and laws that Ms. Smith is the expert on and came to us early on in the process and said, let me give you the broader landscape as you're developing your IRP so that we can make sure we're in step with South Carolina. So again, long-winded answer, but we feel very firmly that P0 is not consistent with South Carolina.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. I want to unpack some of your testimony a little bit more. When you talk about P0, I think you said that it requires 53% more gas. Is that correct? More gas than P3 fall base? 53% more?
Thank you for that clarifying question. I'm going to ask if I misstate anything, Mr. Quinto, jump to the mic. But it's really to say that by the end of the planning horizon, more than half of your energy would be projected to come from gas. So existing plus new resources without any of the other resources being added. So the portfolio under a P0 view would have more than half the energy coming from natural gas, which P3 fall base only has a quarter of projected by 2038 coming from natural gas. So you go from our recommended portfolio of 25% of the energy in 2038 coming from gas to 53%. That doubles your commodity price risk. It increases your concentration on a resource as opposed to having a diverse portfolio of resources. And it is not as forward-looking with respect to foreseeable conditions.
Is gas a stable commodity? Natural gas?
It's a proven technology and commodity, but we've seen that prices can be volatile. It was just probably 18 months or a year ago when the prices for several months went from $2 or $3 to over $9 an MMBTU, and the fuel cases, as I recall, had dramatic under recoveries for that then needed to be addressed in subsequent fuel cases to catch up on the gas prices. So it's a reliable source. It just, the price can be volatile. And there's also one of the things that got discussed a little with Witness Mitchell, but perhaps not enough, is there's also a finite amount on the delivery side. that you have to really balance how many new pipelines do you believe are going to be able to be built, permitted to increase delivery into the Carolinas. We have done a great job of securing additional pipeline. Mr. Witness Verderami, Witness Mitchell talked about the activities we've been taking, that we've taken, but the trend of late is permitting new pipelines is becoming increasingly difficult. So again, as a foreseeable condition, how foreseeable, I don't know, but how much do we want to depend on our ability to site even more pipelines going into the future? So that's also something that we want to be thinking about.
So as you're, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as you're thinking through the available resources, you are thinking about price volatility. That's my focus right now.
Absolutely.
Price.
We've run sensitivities, many sensitivities on those. And of note, right, we didn't discuss this much at all, but when we did the requested mini-max analysis from the ORS, which took 108 additional production cost runs to include P0 with commodity prices in there, with carbon prices in there, including zero as a carbon price, but also higher carbon prices. P0 was not the preferred portfolio. And again, it's not the perfect metric, but even using that metric of mini-max regret analysis, P3 fall base had the minimum regret across those range of sensitivities.
Okay, so price volatility, and then you also mentioned availability, potential issues with availability depending on siting new pipelines. So those are some issues associated with gas. Let's talk about, do you have any other observations or findings you'd like to share or opinions about gas and its volatility or stability?
Maybe the thing I just very briefly share is if I picked any resource, it has there are some really good things I can say about all the resources in our plan, and I can tell you a lot about the risks of all the resources. So it's really, it's hard, even myself, and I've done this for 35 years now, I have to step back sometimes and remind myself not to get overly absorbed in one particular risk factor or one particular benefit, because gas has some great benefits too. I mean, it can run when needed 5 days in a row. If I have cloudy, cold weather and I need, I lose a nuclear plant because of, something trips offline, a gas plant can just turn on and run 5 straight days as long as there's gas availability. And that's a great thing about gas. But then I can also, as I just did, tell you a lot of the risks about over-dependence on gas. I could do that for each resource. I actually sat down one time and did a little high-level matrix to say pros and cons, and it's pretty easy to fill up both boxes for every resource type of the pros and cons of each resource. And I think the diversification, that's when we say diversified and all of the above, it's not because it sounds good or it's a catchphrase. It's really diversifying yourself on many fronts, whether it's regulatory fronts that these all face challenges, whether it's operational, or whether it's even, you think about supply chain, just having diversity in supply chain. Right now, gas it's very difficult. I mean, it's hard to build. I mean, we're back to the days where EPC contractors are getting booked up, and for people that don't have clarity in their plans or wait, they may be getting kicked to the back of the line. Turbine manufacturers, there's only 3 of them really in the world, and this is a global demand. We heard some of the Middle East companies are buying up large portions of the production slots for gas turbines. And so, there is not infinite supply chain for any of these resources, and they each have their own. Some are more subject to tariffs. Stuff coming out of China right now, as we all know from the news, has got tariff risk. So again, Commissioner, I think it's, with respect to gas, it's got pros and cons, and finding the right balance is what we're really seeking here.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to transition to coal. How many coal plants are in the company's territory in South Carolina?
No active coal plants. We have retired the coal plants that we did have in South Carolina. We had the Robinson. We had Robinson. I'm trying to think of our South Carolina plants.
W.S. Lee is a former coal site. While none of the coal sites, active coal sites, are located in South Carolina, the ones in North Carolina through the dual state system serve customers across the entire system, North and South Carolina. But none of them are physically located here in South Carolina.
Okay. So what I find interesting is that it seems to me, and I haven't all the way I haven't thought through this entirely, and I'm not sure how it could be done. I think it could be done. It would cost a little money. But let's just say North Carolina said, we don't want these coal plants here anymore, or we don't want them operational, and they expedited their retirement through some mechanism, even more so than what you all are facing now. Doesn't that put South Carolina ratepayers in a similar situation in terms of dealing with the reality that coal is just not as widely available and seen as favorably as it once was as a generation resource?
Yeah, I mean, in the hypothetical, if they were to take something extreme and say you got to be out of it all, but by 2028 or something, I think you'd have a real discussion here with what's the attendant impact in South Carolina. I would just point out really importantly here, though, that the coal plant retirement dates that are in this plan are not out of step with studies we did well before 951, right? There's nothing being accelerated to that level that's extreme. These are coal retirement dates that they've changed a year or two here or there. Some have gone back, a couple have gone up 1 year, but this is very similar to well before any new North Carolina law. It's very consistent with the last depreciation study that this commission has approved in the last general rate case. And so there was this discussion of North Carolina law accelerating coal retirements. That's simply not the case in the plan we're putting forward. These retirement dates are very well, we call it an orderly transition, so that we're spacing them out appropriately so that we can have the right amount of time to replace them, that we can prioritize the retirements in a way that makes sense. They're consistent with our peer utilities here. Again, it's a lot of units, seems big. If I put it on, we talk about 8,400 megawatts, but if I take 20% of that for South Carolina, because power flows across both, and, it's 1,600 megawatts, which, you've got several coal plants in South Carolina that add up to well above that are retiring in the same, again, no North Carolina law, but Williams, Watery, Cross, Winya, they're all of our peers are also looking to exit coal in a similar scale and pace, if not even a little accelerated, compared to the company. So I certainly want to leave this commission with the firm fact that we are not accelerating coal retirements due to North Carolina law. We are orderly exiting out of 60, 70 plants that will be 60, approaching 70 years old, consistent with the industry's exit out of coal and our peers' exit out of coal. And in no way does North Carolina law drive those accelerated, quote unquote accelerated, because we don't look at them as accelerated. We look at them as an orderly transition that's consistent with the industry and with our peers.
And I think we have heard from other witnesses, Davis, witness from Pawnee, who've pointed to the national trends and utilities struggling with this across the country on how to reliably retire these assets to mitigate risk, and bring resources online that can help deliver reliable service as these do reach end of life, these coal units. So definitely point to the national trend as well.
Well, I think it's important for us maybe to slow down here and sort of really unpack this, because unpack the coal retirement, because maybe it's just me. Maybe I missed something, but I definitely got the sense from some of the testimony and questioning that a main driver for the company retiring their coal fleet was in some way connected to North Carolina law. So let's
Yeah, let me
make
unpack
sure
that.
we get that right.
Yeah, no, let's make sure we get that right. So everything I think, the other witnesses have said about the national trend, what our peers are doing, that supports all of it. Specific to North Carolina law, the coal plants are good reliability resources, but they are aging, right? But they also just don't run that much anymore. They're being asked to run, as you heard Witness Holman talk about, more like peaking resources, which they were never designed to do. Well, the other implication of that is because they run at what we call capacity factors or utilization rates, they run very low. Even though they're high carbon intensity, they just don't put that much carbon into the system because we don't run them that much, right? And so they're not big contributors from a North Carolina lens, to meeting our carbon reduction targets, because it's not like we're running them base load. These get run very just during very high load seasons for very short periods of time. And so the North Carolina law is not contributing to these retirements. This is a operational industry risk. We just got further restrictions that you heard testimony on last week, not just from the Clean Air Act, Section 111, which sets forth very, strict parameters for how coal has to be modified or retired, but also the mercury and air toxins rule, and the effluent limit guidelines you'll hear called ELG rules that have gotten more stringent, that's adding costs to operating these aging units. And then everything Witness Verderami spoke about in terms of coal mines going bankrupt, transportation systems that were built around coal railroads have revised their business model not to be built around coal, to trying to find qualified boiler engineers and parts. I think I've said in an ex parte once, my son graduated mechanical a couple of years ago right here at South Carolina. And I asked him one time, I said, well, how many of your peers want to get into the coal industry? And he looked at me with a funny eye, and he said, I don't know a single mechanical engineer at South Carolina that has any interest in working in a coal plant or designing parts for a coal plant. And so where's that going to be 12 years from now? I mean, we're talking orderly transition through 36. How much more of my workforce is going to retire, and who's going to replace them? Assuming I could get the coal, that they were, the coal mines were still in business and the railroads. So we call it devolving. So the devolving nature of the coal industry, along with the obsolescence, is what's driving our retirement schedules. This is not North Carolina law.
I think I'm going to stop there and tag in my teammate, Commissioner Williams. Thank you for your answers.
Thank you, Chair, Vice Chair.
Mr. Snyder, before I turn it back over to someone else, you mentioned the word risk, and of course, risk is a big part of what you have to figure out with an IRP. And there's been a lot, and maybe it's Mr. Stillman, either one of you, there's been a lot of talk about these big companies coming in, big loads. are these located mainly in, the deck territory or the depth territory or North Carolina or South Carolina or where?
So that evolves. As I said, this whole economic, this whole economic development era that we've begun to see about a year ago, it changes rapidly. But what we saw with the filing, the supplemental planning analysis filing, is that if you look at North and South Carolina, the amount of load in South Carolina was about 20% of the total portfolio load. So it's right along kind of the current mix of customers between North and South Carolina. In the June update that I filed, it shifted to where there's actually a little bit more than 20%. I think it's up around a third or so of the load is in South Carolina. So it moves back and forth, but it's roughly in that area.
And I know from hearing from Walmart witnesses and just other companies, a lot of these companies have their own renewable energy goals. Do these renewable energy goals match what Duke's energy renewable goals are?
They do. They're very interested. They're very interested in this proceeding. They do have their clean energy goals, and this is where I think I said the other day that they're having to balance those goals with their need for power and their need to expand and develop their business. So it's a balancing point, but they do have the clean energy goals, and they're very interested in the proceedings here as to how we will achieve those as we move forward.
Do data centers have energy goals? They seem to be taking the majority of the new power that's being asked for. What sort of goals do Google or whatever the companies are? Can you talk about that a little bit?
They all have their own energy goals, but you've heard the Googles and the Apples come out and say that they are striving towards a clean energy future.
Do you feel like they are willing to pay their share?
Yes, I think that's part of the, and I think company witness Reed spoke to the memorandum of understanding and the accelerating clean energy tariffs that they're working on. That's exactly to work with them to achieve some of those goals.
Yeah. Well, and every little county, and I'm from a small county originally, every little county has an industrial park. By locating in these industrial parks rather than some of this farmland, doesn't that help with the distribution or transmission since you're already pretty much there in a lot of them?
So I'd have to think about each individual project. And again, let me step back for just a second and think about the portfolio of the economic development projects. And to be clear, when I say economic development, I'm kind of lumping current businesses who are expanding. So I think in my testimony, I mentioned BMW and some others. Sure. So there's a number of current businesses that are expanding, as well as new entities that are coming to the state. And in South Carolina, in the supplemental planning analysis, I think I said this last week also, that I think it's up to 90% of the portfolio is manufacturing. That I don't know if they're going specifically into those industrial parks, but I'm sure that they're looking at some of those.
And it sounds like a lot of your job. Do you work a lot with our Department of Commerce?
So I do not. I work with, so we've got an economic development group that works very closely with the Department of Commerce in trying to work with those companies as we bring them to the state. So our economic development department provides the energy expertise as the Commerce Department works with those other entities to bring them to the state.
Does the Department of Commerce and other places intervene in cases like this or get involved directly, or most of it's through you or other parties?
I am not aware of them intervening. Again, I think it's more of a partnership as we work with those entities and as they announce to come to the state or to expand within the state. I'm not aware of them being involved in a situation, in this type of hearing.
Okay. Do you think there's anything they could add that's not covered by what you can present?
I hate to say, I don't think that there's anything that they could add. I'm sure that they would sit here and say, yes, they could. But again, it's such a close relationship and we work so well together that I'm trying to convey at least what I know of that relationship and how we work together.
Okay. Well, thank you. Mr. Snyder. Excuse me 1 second. Don't ever get cancer.
Oh,
I'll talk to you about two things. One, you've been throwing everything back here to Ms. Smith's going to have to answer. You think she needs her own lawyer?
yeah, this is one of the first times I've gotten not to be last, and I'm really enjoying it.
I just want to talk to you a little bit about risk. You talk about economic development too in your testimony and in what you presented to us. But the risk, this thing about intention to obtain service and these different companies who are talking about coming here, isn't there some risk there? Let's say that they decide at the last minute, they'll say, well, we don't think there's enough power. We're going to go somewhere else. Really, they're probably saying, well, we don't like the school system or we don't like this, that, and the other. But isn't there some risk there that ratepayers could end up with?
You know, this is getting a lot of attention. I addressed this a little bit on Friday, I think, and I forget who was questioning me about it, but
That was last week.
yeah, me too. Yeah. You know, I certainly, you look at what's happening, and Mr. Stillman talks a lot about with the onshoring of manufacturing. It's not just data centers; it's customers expanding operations as well as data centers. And there's two schools of thought. You're behind the curve, and customers are going to go elsewhere, or you're in front of the curve, and now you've got stranded asset risk, or people like to throw that term out there. And so I think it's really important to think about, you know, as Mr. Stillman said, one is we're doing our very best to do a 50-50 forecast, and others, some are not. Some parts in the country are saying, I want to make sure no matter how much load, I'm 95% sure I can accommodate the highest level, and that's sort of the Georgia Power model. But in this 50-50 load forecast, and we heard discussion last week, and this is hard to debate, is it's a forecast, and forecasts are going to be wrong, and we're forecasting the amount of resources we can bring online, and it's going to be wrong by some amount, right? And so if it was perfect, you'd be right in the middle, and you'd have the perfect forecast, and you'd build just the perfect amount of resources, and you'd be right on plan. The best way I can describe it is we really need to position ourselves, and I think as a state, as a company, to be at or ahead of plan and not behind plan.
Sure.
If my resources are at or above my needs, then that attracts economic development. That maintains reliability. If I find myself ahead of plan for a short amount of time and it looks like the economy starts to downturn a little, maybe I can now retire coal plants that I thought I was going to have to build at without having to build. Maybe I can use that excess to attract businesses because other areas don't have it. So maybe that puts me in a better economic development. Mr. Verderami, we talked a lot about, is well connected to our neighbors. So we can sell excess power that we may have, and all those sales go directly through the fuel clause to customers. What I'm trying to get at is if I'm ahead of plan, I probably have a half a dozen options for the good of customers for being ahead of plan. Now let's flip the coin over, and what if I'm behind plan? What if this load starts showing up but we don't have the resources in flight to meet it.
Do you think it's the company's duty to attract growth or to build to attract growth?
No, I don't. I think our company's duty is to meet growth as it comes. It's not our duty to build excess to attract growth, but I think we have an obligation to serve. We don't call balls and strikes. When we see load, we have an obligation to serve it. I think it's people up the street that call balls and strikes, and then we are the implementers of that policy. But if we're behind plan, it's one of two things are going to happen. The best case is you just stop growth in the state. All these companies now have their own little mini IRP teams. Like everybody we're talking to, they want to come in and they're hiring people that are basically planners and saying, I want to follow your regulatory proceedings. I want to see whether you're in line with your commission, whether you've got plans to meet our growth. And if you don't, I'm not going to look there. I'm going to go talk to other utilities and watch other regulatory proceedings, and I'll move there. If, however, that load comes anyway, then not everybody does that, and maybe some of this load comes and we're behind plan. Well, that presents the worst of all scenarios. Now I've got reliability issues. What if the economy ticks up? And, it's one thing for these big guys to say, I'm not going to locate here, I'm going to locate there. But you still got subdivisions going in and the Walmarts and the smaller stores, not the giant data centers. They're big collectively, but they're not, a gigawatt or a 500 megawatt store. If they start growing in the area and you're not up to plan, now you're, sort of peak season after peak season struggling with reliability. That is not a position we want to plan to be in. Yeah. And so I think there is risk on both sides. To me, to say we're exactly forecasting perfect and we're going to build perfect it would be naive, but we're going to be far better off collectively to be at or slightly ahead of plan because of all the different things we can do to mitigate being ahead of plan and the very, very few options. There is, over my career, this is as thin as the merchant market has ever been. When I say merchant, my neighbors are getting tight. There's no excess, speculative generation that was being built in the early 2000s. That's all been soaked up. Nobody's doing that these days, during sort of that big non-reg push. And so you can't look to your neighbors the way you used to and say, well, if I get behind plan, there's generation here and there. I might have to pay a little premium and I'll get some from some of this excess merchant. That's gone. And so I do think, while there is risk on both sides, the risk is greater for being behind plan than it is for being at or ahead of plan. And we should try our very best to ensure we're at or ahead of plan.
Well, and you mentioned neighbors. I know Georgia has just gone full throttle on growth, but ratepayers are getting a whopping increase in rates in Georgia. Whopping increase is my understanding.
Georgia's a little uniquely positioned with they're now putting their nuclear plants into rates, and so that is, as I understand it, really had a big impact on their rate increase and the concentration that they had there. I think that's one of the benefits of being a little more diversified and, small modular coming in smaller chunks. You're not talking a $40 billion project here, with nuclear.
They're getting a nuclear plant and they're paying extra for it. We're paying extra for one that's not working. If the company, let's just say you build prematurely and it's just more than you need, who should pay for that? The ratepayers or the shareholders?
I believe, that's a prudence question that we would have to have probably a full proceeding on in the context of a future rate case. But I would say, again, we have to recognize that the company's not omniscient, so we can't exactly predict what the economy is going to do and whether we're going to have a recession. I mean, we've been talking a recession for 3 years now, and now people are talking about soft landing and a 50 basis point cut, and we could take off again as an economy. So that's really hard for Mr. Stillman to hit just right. I would say with our obligation to serve, as long as we're acting prudently on the information we knew at the time, I think we can then manage on a go forward. Like I said, we can sell excess power to neighbors and pass those revenues through as a revenue credit in a fuel case. We can look to use any excess length to potentially not build a future plant and instead maybe retire a coal plant without the need for building that next plant that was on the plan down the line. So I think we will do everything in our power to act prudently to minimize if we do end up in that position, Chair Powers. But again, I think that, the standard is, did we act prudently for the information we knew at the time the decision was being made?
Thank you. It's funny, and I don't even know what the context was. You mentioned the word cloudy. When I first got here, we used to hear all the time that solar, you can't count on that. It's going to be cloudy, or it's going to rain, or that sort of thing. And now we're trying to build it in, and that's a good thing. Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thank you, Chair Powers.
Thank you. Any other? Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Chair Powers. First, I just want to kind of tell you what my last question I hope will be, which is that you've listened to all of this, and there may be something we haven't asked you a question about. So just if there's something that you really hoped that we would ask you, I want you to be thinking in terms of what that is. But I have specific questions, so I'm just giving you some lead time on that. Mr. Stillman, I'm going to pick up where Commissioner Powers may have covered some of this, but just for clarity, are high capacity users cost appropriately allocated? And I know that's not quite your role, but from where you sit, what can you add to that?
I would actually probably ask you to ask Ms. Bateman that, because it is a cost allocation thing, and I think I heard Witness Reed talk a little bit about that, about how because they're high capacity, they have a lot of energy, so that they do pick up their proper ratio of costs. But I'm getting way out of my wheelhouse at this point.
Okay, I understand that, but I did not want to leave you out, and I don't think I have any other questions for you. Mr. Quinto.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good
Or
afternoon.
Afternoon, yeah. Are you familiar with the Winter Storm Elliott docket and the report that was filed?
I'm generally familiar with the docket. I haven't reviewed the report.
Okay. I wanted to talk about the reserve margin. So you might be the wrong person for me to be asking you about this, but the question is kind of, there were corrective actions that the company took in response to the Winter Storm Elliott experience and the report. And does that buffer our need for the 22% reserve margin? Was that factored in? I'm trying to ask it multiple ways, but you did good things after Winter Storm Elliott to ensure that those problems wouldn't exist again. And are we over insuring ourselves with the reserve margin?
So I'll start maybe with the first portion. So our resource adequacy study does consider the impacts of Winter Storm Elliott, both the weather side, the load response, which was a huge portion of that, right? How does load respond in extremely cold temperatures? And we saw, it's very load responsive. The performance of units during those cold weather times, so that data and information is factored into the time to fail and time to repair that's factored into our calculation of our reserve margin. My understanding, and based on some of the testimony of Mr. Verderame and some of the other folks that may have more intimate knowledge on Mr. Holman as well. The companies are continuing to address weatherization of
Right.
our units, and I think that's really what you're getting to is that weatherization going to cover a portion of that increase in the reserve margin?
Exactly.
And what I'd really say to that is we are looking at a balance here of a aging coal asset fleet, right? That's getting to the end of its life. We're 50 years on a lot of these units. They'll be 60 or near 70 years by the time that they retire based on the retirement schedule that we've put forth. While some of those mitigation methods or measures we hope will help, until they're completely proven out, it's hard to say how completely effective they've been. So it's a portion of continuing to rely on those updated pieces of information as we go and continue to study resource adequacy. I'll also add that not just looking at one isolated variable as we go throughout time is important in the context of resource adequacy. So as our neighboring utilities continue to change, how much can we rely on them? What does the transmission look like? What is the ability to rely on them? And then how does this load response continue to develop? How are we looking at how load responds in that time? And a significant factor that really does is of interest of us is this new economic development load when it comes onto the system, as Mr. Stillman has pointed out, has a very different load factor and what it relies on, and it's exposure or non-exposure to temperature of ambient temperature. So I think it's important as we take those next steps to consider all of the changing factors at one time.
And I appreciate that. I'm not sure if you answered the question though, because I was trying to ask specifically about, you made improvements, and does that reserve margin, is that needed on top of those improvements that you made? Do you need the full 22%? Do you know that you need the full 22%, knowing it's a estimate, but based on the investments that the company's already wisely made to make us more resilient? You may have answered it, but I just lost it in my memory.
No, and I'll invite Mr. Schneider here he may be a little more familiar with specifics,
Okay.
but my understanding is those are winterization activities to continue to walk down the units, inspect them prior to winter outage, the winter season, understand how equipment may be exposed to cold temperatures, and we're certainly seeing that. Not all of the unit failures were simply due to cold temperatures. So while that can help us in the future, it may not mitigate all of the risks. So while there may be some downward pressure on reliability in that specific asset, I would say that there's probably more exposure to changing neighbors and the load that's coming relative to the performance of our units. Mr.
I get
Schneider?
that.
Yeah, I would just say, echo what Mr. Quinto said, and he was, I think he got there with where I was going to go to, which is there's multiple factors. We have the efforts we're taking, I'll call it tailwind, right? That helps. That could help put downward pressure on reserves, just what you're talking about. But we face a lot of headwinds. We still have a lot of neighbor assistance in our reserve margin study. Could that further erode? That might cause for an increase. We still have a very low load forecast error. If this economy continues to flutter back and forth and we're unsure, that load forecast error could grow. That would be a headwind that could cause the need for an upper. So in isolation, it's very helpful and these actions are good. But the reserve margin is driven by, 4 or 5 major variables, and the data today, what we know today says 22%. I'm hoping that one particular variable gets better the next time we do it. But we may get overwhelmed by other variables. That'll all happen in that next comprehensive study.
So in the theme that we've got going on, is your testimony that the 22% is just right?
It's just right now. That's
Okay.
That's nice and warm porridge.
Right. Okay. And you kind of got ahead to where I was going to ask next. we've only experienced increasing reserve margins. In the industry, might we see a decreasing reserve margin the next time the study is done? I mean, is it?
It's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. It is. I mean, if we see that maybe the load forecast error comes in a little bit and we get some stability in load, if maybe some of the weather sensitivity to this load declines through EE and DSM efforts, and it's more stable, if performance improves over time, there is a possibility that it could.
Okay. And Mr. Quinto, I think it was suggested that I ask you more about the electric vehicles and how you all estimated those numbers and your confidence there. Is it the right person?
I believe I referred to Mr. Stillman on rebuttal. So
Okay.
That would be me.
Okay.
So yes, and I think some of the questions, the first one that I'll address, I think you had asked about, are there any hybrid vehicles in the forecast? And I think the answer was no, because most people, when they think of hybrid, they don't think of battery plug-in hybrids, which there are plug-in hybrids. So every year is a little bit different, but if you go out to the end of our forecasting period, about 25% of the vehicles that we're assuming will be on the road in the Carolinas are plug-in hybrids. So I did want to at least mention that. The other, so how do we estimate electric vehicle load? This is one area where we do use an external source. We use Guidehouse. I believe Dominion, South Carolina uses a similar service. And essentially think of it as a model or a forecast that's looking at the total cost of the vehicle. So there's a comparison of what's the total cost of an electric vehicle compared to, I'll call it a traditional vehicle using gas. And it's not just how much does it cost to buy it and purchase it and drive it off the lot, but it's over the life of the vehicle. So what does it cost to charge that vehicle based on the number of miles that it is expected to run every year for its life? And the same with gas prices with your more traditional. What's the expected gas price and the maintenance costs and things like that? So there's a comparison that is done going out in time that looks at the total costs and how those costs change over time. And I should say also vehicle availability plays into this also. So as and I know there's been some pullback from electric vehicle manufacturers in the short term, but long term, that's still going to, there's still going to be many more models available and the price points are coming down. So as a result, that's what's indicating to us the level of electric vehicles that we expect through our forecasting period. And then we take the expected vehicle miles driven and the charging cost to come up with what's the electric impact for charging those vehicles.
And so part of what I heard you say is that you understand that what is happening nationally is that the increase is not as dramatic as maybe was once forecasted, but it's still the amount of electric vehicles out there are still increasing, and that's what you're planning for.
Yes. So if I think about the forecast that we did for the supplemental planning analysis, there was an expectation around the level of EV sales and charging that we would see in 2024, for example. We have seen growth over 2023, but it hasn't gotten to the level that we expected when we put the forecast together. So it's kind of at a lower starting spot, but we're still expecting, as you go out 10 years, for example, to see the growth in a similar percentage terms of what is the percentage growth that we expect. I think that's still well within reason for what we have in the supplemental planning analysis.
Thank you. Have you had any other that might have been the answer to my first question about, is there anything I haven't asked you that you want to share?
No, that was on my mind, so I'm glad
Okay.
you addressed it.
Good. Okay. How about you, Mr. Quinto?
My critical portion of this is that the companies have met the commission directives and the rules under the IRP statute for the information needed to make a judgment on the most reasonable and prudent plan. 53 portfolios, a lot of scenario analysis, sensitivity analysis, looking at cost impacts and what happens if something changes in our uncertainty. So putting forward the plan as a comprehensive and reasonable assessment is really my main takeaway for the commission.
Thank you. And Mr. Snyder, I've got some questions for you. I'm thinking about behind the meter batteries and about the estimates, but I'm also thinking about the company talking about all of the above. Why is behind the meter battery not a more significant modeling opportunity, given the all of the above approach and the need to check and adjust? And given the North Carolina experience?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of discussion on that. I was listening closely last week when that was being discussed. Couple of really quick points. One is, let's think difference in utility scale versus behind the meter. It's behind the meter is completely customer adoption driven. And so you have to have a forecast of what that is going to be. And I know there's a range. Once we get out of these pilots, I think, as Mr. Duff testified, we'll be in a better position. But when I look nationally at behind the meter battery, we're talking about programs that are 5 and 10 megawatts, right? Our short-term action plan calls for 2,700 megawatts of utility scale batteries. These behind the meter may grow over time and may not. To Mr. Stillman's point on EVs, look how long it's taken. EVs have been around for 20 years, and we're just now starting to get what is the trend going to look like. I don't know a single person with a battery personally, like in my neighborhood or coworkers, like, hey, how's your Tesla battery in your house? That doesn't mean it's not going to come in the next 20 years. It certainly is, I believe. But really the numbers I'm hearing nationally as well, look, is, maybe it takes you a decade to get from 10 megawatts to 100 or 200 megawatts. What is that likely going to do? It's going to displace 100 megawatts of battery that's already in my plan, right? And I'm going to have plenty of opportunity to not build that utility scale 100 megawatt battery because I now have this pilot that was successful. And rather than building out of that 2,700 megawatts and over the life of the plan, I think it's, a couple thousand more. I certainly will have chance in future iterations of the IRP to allow the model to pick one versus the other, right? And because they're really substitutes for each other. We aren't maxed out on utility. Mr. Quinto mentioned non-binding constraints, right? We put constraints on the amount of battery, but they're not binding. So in other words, I don't need all the batteries at the utility scale. We let the model pick. It's not picking them all. So why is that important? If it was picking them all, I might need those plus this extra 100 megawatts of behind the meter batteries. But because it's not non-binding, what's likely going to happen is that battery will just be a distributed battery instead of a utility scale. Mm-hmm. But putting it in today, when we don't know, is it going to be 100 megawatts? Is it going to be 50? Is it going to be 200? And it's not going to change the rest of the resources in any material fashion. In all likelihood, just knowing the characteristics of a behind the meter is going to be very similar to the characteristics of utility scale. It will reduce, hopefully in the future, the amount of utility scale needed. But from a materiality perspective, it's too immature to spend a whole lot of modeling resources to try and fine tune 50, 100, 150 when I'm planning a 40,000 megawatt system at this point in time. but hopefully it will have promise in the future.
And when we talk about behind the meter battery, you talked about the neighborhood sort of battery, but I think Walmart talked about that as one potential for them. But is there behind the meter industrial battery that we would be thinking about at much bigger scale?
Yeah, much like, behind the meter diesel generators, hopefully that,
Right.
you now start to get that converting over. But even that program right now, we're talking hundreds of megawatts, not thousands,
Okay.
right? So how long does it take to develop? And when it does, could maybe that 100 be 400, and that 2030 3 or 4 battery that was going to be 300 megawatts located here now might be distributed. I think there is, potential for that. Something we're clearly going to watch with these pilots and how they develop. I guess what I'm trying to leave you with, Commissioner Williams, is it's not going to have them, in my mind, subject to future modeling costs and all that, but it's not going to have a material impact. It will flip out of, the model will stop selecting a certain amount of utility scale. And again, we've got several thousand megawatts of utility scale in the plan, and it will divert that to behind the meter, much like when you have a bunch of rooftop solar, the need for utility scale solar, because it's the same generation in the same hours, it changes, as Mr. Stillman changes his rooftop projections, it impacts the economics of utility scale solar. And I see the same thing happening down the road with batteries, but I think we're in a good place for now. And it, clearly something though that Mr. Duff and that team will be working on as we go into the next IRP cycle.
So putting it into some of the language that I've used before, the conundrum that I talked about in terms of, we've got small modular nuclear out there, we've got hydrogen, we've got all these other things that are, to be determined, but they're there as possible as in your IRP, offshore wind and onshore wind. But the difference here is that you've got a large amount of utility scale meters that are kind of, to a certain extent, interchangeable with the idea of the behind the meter battery. Did I botch?
Yeah, no, I don't think you did at all. I think
Okay.
that's perfect. I mean, it's a scale. The one thing is scale, and the other thing is it's completely adoption driven, which is difficult until you have data. Again, to know, you brought up a great point. Is it 100? Is it 400? I can tell you it's unlikely to be 3,000, right?
Right.
So the fact that it's utility, the other ones are utility sort of in their control, or industry control on the supply side, SMRs. You're not going to have behind the meter SMRs. You're not going to have behind the meter
Right.
offshore wind, right? I'm not, I
Right.
don't mean to be facetious, but
No.
but the fact that this is customer driven, adoption rate driven, it's something we're going to need to get our arms around, and then have that influence the plan in terms of the amount of utility scale that will be needed over time.
I will just add, I agree with everything Mr. Schneider said. One of the things that I think about with the difference between SMR, offshore wind, some of these long lead time resources versus these near-term penetration of supply-side battery or demand-side batteries is the uncertainty in the near term relative to how those resources develop and what's needed in our near-term actions. So to Mr. Schneider's point, if there's a higher development of batteries on the demand side, that may offset some future needs for supply-side batteries from the utility scale. When I look at the uncertainty in that, assuming something higher may put us in a worse position for pursuing resources now. So at least we can get started on doing that and defer those needs if we do, if it does come back to be higher in those projections in the future. When I look at the long lead time resources, we need to start those activities now. to ensure that they'll be there in the future. But if they don't develop, we still have time to check and adjust to them. By incorporating those into the forecast now, we're assuming the model could just select them without considering, customer adoption and the information that we really need from some of these pilot programs. Are you putting yourself in a worse spot from having the resources that you need in the near term and midterm by making a planning assumption like that? So that's really where I distinguish long lead time decisions in the model versus something like this on the demand side from a selectability or forecasting those in with that type of uncertainty.
Thank you to both of you. I want to talk a little bit about Bad Creek too. And I need a reminder in terms of the agreement that you all made to update, if the costs go up by more than 15%. And that was an agreement that you've made with ORS, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
And the interest I have is the purpose in that, given the fact that the IRP is not determinative. So from your perspective, why agree to that, providing that information if the cost goes up by more than 15%?
Couple of fold, right? One is it's a unique project. It's not, you're not going to see it in anyone else's resource plan because they don't have an existing, Bad Creek facility from which to expand. And it's a large scale project. It's a long lead time, large scale, but we're getting close to, moving forward with development, as you saw in our near-term action plan of filing for a site certificate for it, siting application. And so given the scale of the project, the uniqueness of it, we will obviously in future IRPs be updating Bad Creek. This is like an additional layer, not in lieu of anything. It's on top of everything, right? And so it's just to provide assurance that as we're now far enough along where we're refining engineering estimates, we're getting bids in, we're getting EP, that as we start going through that phase, getting major equipment coming in, as we get clarity around tax policy on various aspects of this, because this, one of the great things about this is it's eligible for the IRA tax benefits, right? So there's a lot of moving parts that we're further along, for example, way further along on this than offshore wind. So we're, just really out of transparency and wanting to ensure that, hey, these costs, as all this information comes in, are still tracking, where we thought they would. We wanted to, we're happy to agree to say, hey, on top of updating these costs when we do future IRP updates or comprehensive IRPs, if we see anything, if we get some bids in and labor inflation hits harder than we thought, or stealing, a lot of steel, a lot of concrete in that facility, those are commodities that go up and down. We're going to be very transparent with the commission, the ORS, and say, here's if we see a cost over, and we're going to let you know ASAP. And that was just given the nature, the scope, the size, the scale, unique nature of it, that we, as an extra, layer, where, we wanted to certainly agree to that. We agreed to it in both states and all, because again, it's a big project. It's all, that's all that construction, all that is going to be right up the street from Commissioner Caston here, and we will do it nice and neat. That's one of the beauties of that project, is it's using existing facilities with a small environmental footprint. But it's only it's all the projects in South Carolina, but
Right.
80% of the costs are going to go the other direction.
So it's because you were asked, because you're doing it in North Carolina and for transparency, and nothing in terms of any kind of pre-approval.
No, not
cost.
asking. We're just trying to be transparent, let you know where we're at. come through with, detailed studies often, give you as much comfort as we can that we're acting prudently, but we're not asking for pre-approval.
It feels like about a year ago, but I think about 2 hours ago, Commissioner Caston was having a conversation, I think with you, Mr. Snyder, and it really was or it could have been, anyway, the question was about the two-state system and the challenges over kind of organizing by state after the merger. No, well, I'll go ahead and ask that question. Once the merger's in place, might it be easier to provide data on a South Carolina basis or data in terms of the near-term action plan based on what might be happening in our state versus, or what would be, I'll back up and say, in looking at like this South Carolina near-term action plan and then finding the very same information, I think in probably an exhibit that we've been given for North Carolina, and then also the same information in the overall IRP. Is that true that the numbers of what you're going to generate per generation source are the same in all three cases, correct? Because it's the overall.
Yeah, we operate the single system, so it's just a reporting function on that. To the extent there is, let's say, what I was testifying to earlier is I'm not aware of precedents where you've sort of done it for the entire system. If there are unique resources in a multi-state system where you want to ring fence the costs and the benefits to a single, then a single utility would be more efficient to even do that mechanism. I think that would be much more efficient.
And my question there is more about, in the future, might it be possible to get the data in terms of, the generation that would be in the future generated in South Carolina, and more specific IRP data focused on a state-by-state basis once you all are merged. I'm not asking for, it's not about cost, it's about understanding that you have a responsibility to your customers, and that's two states, but we have a responsibility to one state. And so understanding in exhibits and bite-sized information that the relationship between those two.
I would say overall, it's going to make all the regulatory more efficient and data more understandable, I think, by having a single utility versus two, and joint dispatch, all gets internalized, and you don't have three balancing areas, you have one. All of that's going to, you're not going to have, two regulatory proceedings, you're going to have one. So certainly going to be benefits, I would think, from a administrative and clarity of information for all parties when we go to a single utility. But overall, I think, we see the bigger, the big picture is, we're going to be able to, what I think of as, I'm going to be able to site more efficiently.
Right.
I'm going to be able to build more efficiently, and I'm going to be able to operate. So I've first got to site it, then I've got to build it, and then I got to operate it. Each leg of the way, I'm going to generate benefits with a single utility versus two, right? You're going to have just a larger scope and scale. I can put all my, subject to transmission, obviously, but I'm going to be able to put gas plants near the gas pipeline. I'm going to put solar where the best solar fields are. I'm going to put wind where the wind blows the most. I'm going to be able to put my storage where I can get the highest tax and best transmission benefits on a single large footprint. So for the three big steps, site, build, operate, we think there's a lot of benefit to the system on the regulatory front, and it'll be, and then the information, to your point, will be, you won't have the two states and joint dispatch and how much flowed across the tie line and how much of that flow was South Carolina versus North Carolina. So I do think it will make, it more transparent for you, Commissioner.
And that was my goal. I wasn't, or my interest in expressing, I wasn't questioning its value overall, even though you added some additional relevant points. Okay, the question that I started asking about, and this was with Commissioner Caston, and you talked about the benefit of the dual state system to the state. And what I wondered and thought he was about to ask was, is that quantified anywhere? Is that modeled anywhere? Because, this universe is huge and specific, and you are making a ton of best estimates. And there are times when it feels like we're being told, trust us, it all works out for the good of South Carolina, and it all works out for the good of North Carolina. But if there were an estimate in terms of what the benefit of the two-state system was, the dual state, to South Carolina, then maybe some of those specific concerns about what South Carolina might be paying for that happens in North Carolina, you might see the balance. I know I didn't turn that into a good question, but my question initially was, is that estimated as a value at any point? The value of the two-state system to each of the states.
Yeah, and, this question gets asked in different forms, so it is a tough question to ask, right? So I appreciate where you're going with the question. The difficulty in a cost-benefit analysis like that is you've got to assume current state with an alternate state,
right?
A two-state system. And what a two-state system would look like means 20 things to 20 people, right? Whether it's modelers or commissioners or policymakers up at the two legislatures. If I said, what would an independent state look like? I would get dramatically different answers. Are we talking about splitting resources on a load ratio share? Are we talking about assigning direct resources? Are we talking about still operating together, not operating together? So unless you have a very clear definition of what single state system is, what a South Carolina system and a North Carolina system, what does that look like legally? The modelers need to know, how do I model that? Like, how would I model in North Carolina and South Carolina? And everybody has an idea on it, right? I think as you think, oh, no, I'm talking this. I'm just talking new resources. No, I'm talking existing resources. Oh, I want my share of the nuclear. No, you can't have it's where they're located. It's not where, there's a lot of ways you can think about. I've heard people say, well, no, what if you just kept the resources in your state and they kept the resources in that can't work, right? We've been paying for these together and benefiting from these together for decades. So location's really irrelevant, right, to the question, but sometimes you hear that posed. Or, well, what if we assign direct, or what if we split them by load ratio? Well, when you operate one state and they're all in the same balancing area, it influences how the other states are going to run, right? So if the nuclear plants are running in South Carolina, I need less generation in North Carolina. If they're not, I need more. And so how I would extract those two to have this dual state, a North Carolina system and a South Carolina, becomes extraordinarily challenging to do when they've been put together for, 7, 8 decades. To Commissioner Thomas' point, from the Catawba River days, it's hard to think about how two single state systems would actually be modeled.
And I get that even better after your answer. But I was trying to ask, what's the the cost, the benefit, the financial benefit to each state of being in a dual state versus a single state. And your answer might be the same, but I just want to be sure that my question was clear.
So I guess, you know, the reason it becomes where I went into that long answer was benefit means it's better than the alternative, and
Okay.
show me how expensive the alternative is. And modeling the alternative means modeling everything I just said.
Okay.
What does a South Carolina, let's just take a South Carolina lens. What would a South Carolina only system look like?
Okay.
It's really, you get a lot of different thoughts and answers to that. You know, and that's why we tend to think of it as the scope and scale has benefited. We can tell by the lower than average rates and all that. But how would we now on a go forward, if it's a single asset, it's easier to do. We can say, here's what it looks like if you share in that, you know, I'm going to use offshore wind because that's where we spent a week last week talking about. Here's what it looks like shared. Here's what it might look like if all the costs and benefits stayed in this state. And you could say, here's the risks and the benefits of that with a single asset. It becomes difficult when you talk about how do I split the entirety of a two-state system in, you know, that's been operating as a dual state system into single states. That's a little more challenging.
Thank you. Do you have anything you hoped that we would ask you about that you haven't gotten a chance to express?
You know, I appreciate everyone's time in this commission as well. I know you're wrestling a lot of different factors. You know, Commissioner or Vice Chair Williams, I heard your comment about you know, your strength and football coach saying, you know, have the belief and put in tremendous effort, and you'd be amazed at what you can accomplish, or almost nothing's. I probably butchered that, but something close to it. Well, I feel like that's what we've really attempted to do. We've spent 18 months. We were very laser focused from the start on a plan that was meeting South Carolina law. It was not only meeting the letter, but the intent of the law. That gave us a resource portfolio that was the most reasonable, least cost, least risk plan for South Carolina. I tend to think about the fact that I've got people in South Carolina saying maybe my porridge is a little too warm or cold, and I got people in North Carolina saying my porridge is too cold because you're way out in 35 and beyond, and I wanted 30. And it's really not about 30 or 35 or 38. Is that mix of resources providing reliable service while meeting the balancing factors that were laid out in South Carolina. We've looked at it a lot of different ways in this proceeding. I talked about our plan squarely aligns with our peer utilities, except for a couple of small areas. I think that speaks volumes because you can get lost in the rhetoric, but the results are pretty telling. And so, you know, Commission, I would just say I would leave you with, you know, this very much is a plan we feel is beneficial to the customers we serve and the customers we're going to serve with this growing system. I'm really glad Commissioner Williams had or Vice Chair Williams, excuse me, had a good discussion on coal retirements, because in no way were coal retirements anything other than what we've been trying to tell you for a number of years now, that we as an industry have to have an orderly transition out. This is not shaped by North Carolina law. And I guess the one thing that was in my testimony you didn't talk to about is the all source. There was a lot of discussion on the all source. You know, you'll hear about it from a policy perspective from Witness Smith. You heard Witness Donishad talk to you about it from a executability and the delays it puts in. So I won't hit it from a policy or from a delays. I will just say though, it may have academic appeal, but you really have to understand each of the resources and where the market is, you know, for those resources. So SMRs, you're not going to do an all source. We are the largest licensed nuclear operators. You're not going to do an all source for SMRs. There was discussion on wind. Wind will not come into being through an all source. I mean, the wind developers have clearly said we want approved wind in an IRP and we want the utility to partner with us. It did not come about the way solar did, which came about as a QF resource under PURPA. So solar, the reason there's an active solar market is it came in under PURPA. And there was, 80 megawatt and under renewables. Wind is above 80 megawatts, so it's not going to come in as a QF under that. Gas plants are reliability resources that we've owned and operated and developed long before any of the last 5 or 10 years worth of laws have been around, but our reliability resources that we are charged with serving, we have been charged to own and operate and reliably operate for decades, and we will continue to do that with gas, and there is no gas merchant resources in our footprint anymore. There was a handful back in the day. Those are all fully contracted now. So the concept of an all-source RFP, 10 years ago in an RTO maybe where there's a bunch of merchant generation of different types under a different regulatory compact may have made some sense. It really makes no sense in South Carolina where we have a mandate to serve. There is a unique market for solar, and that's why the legislature carved out a CPRE procurement process. That unique marketplace does not exist for the other resources in the state, nor has policy pushed us that way in other resources. So we are going to be very competitive in our procurement processes across all of our resource types. We have a prudency obligation before this commission when we bring those forward, when we competitively bid procurement, engineering, major equipment, operations, and you have oversight over that. And so I think we got a little distracted on the all source when it's not at the heart of this one. So I did address a lot of that in my testimony. We didn't get asked many questions on it, so I throw that in as sort of an afterthought, commissioners, but really just appreciate the commission's time. And I'll just end with, for my team that's watching, again, I appreciate them. I mean, we really, the level of effort that was put into this, it has been tremendous. My team worked many Saturdays and Sundays, many late night, 10 o'clock texts going back and forth. This model didn't run. How do I get that? Kick that back off. That went on for months, and they worked to produce this at great personal sacrifice. So for those watching, I wanted to send my appreciation to the broader team. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder, and thank you, all three of you, and no further questions from me.
Mr. Snyder, you sound like you just won the Academy Award or something.
Mr. Quinto dominated Friday, so we had a bet on word count. So I'm just trying to get the over.
Right. I think Mr. Caston has a couple of questions, and see Mr. Thomas, then we're going to try and wrap y'all up.
All I have, and these were generated from the other questions, so I apologize for extending it. But following up somewhat on Vice Chair Williams' questions, it appears portfolios P1, P2, P3 front load cost for latest technology breakthroughs that are to occur late in the plan. Is this a fair assessment?
Front load costs. I would say P1 has more front loaded costs than 2, and 2 has more than 3, and 3, our recommended plan, I don't think has a ton of front loaded costs. That's one of the things. Just real quick, I mean, you're talking the biggest, offshore wind's a big expense, but we're not advocating at this time that we put that in the near term action plan for that. Only the ARFI is in on that. The nuclear, I think you heard a lot of discussion last week with our nuclear witness. The total cost, $440 million in the near-term action plan. 20% would be $88 million allocated to South Carolina to keep new nuclear as an option for the mid-30s. So that's in the long lead time stuff. I think when you look at the South Carolina portion, and it's just the early development dollars, it doesn't ask, we're not outlining significant costs in the next several years.
All right, well, let me ask these because I think that's where I'm trying to get to. I didn't see any detail relative to portfolio P0 that showed when and if SMR and or when was included. Now, that could have been an oversight on my part. Is it there and I just missed it?
It's not there.
All right,
Well,
with that
In the planning horizon, go ahead, Mr. Quinto.
The details for the supplemental update to no carbon constraints P0, there is information in that in the supplemental planning analysis in the technical appendix. And there is some onshore wind selected in that portfolio in the planning horizon, 1,050 megawatts through 2038. So even in a no carbon constraints portfolio, it does identify wind as a valuable resource. Again, we're talking about diversity of resources, the value of the resource itself from its energy provides with no fuel, but also the tax credits, right, that are available to it as well. So that's something that the model's obviously looking at in the selection there.
and SMR also?
SMR is not selected
Okay.
under that case.
I kind of remember that on some of those others, but in any event, when I look at, and I can't remember which witness it was I was asking about this, and I think this was passed on to you. I'm not sure. It'll probably work its way downhill further, but I'll ask. Relative to ORS's evaluation report, that table 45, which is, well, on the watermark, I think it's page 142 or 170 on the top of the page, at least top of my page is 127 or 155. It's comparison of SPA portfolio rate impacts. Table 45.
Yep,
We're there.
In any event, when we're talking about cost, what effect would it have on customers in South Carolina? In response to that ORS request 9/16, Duke provided the rate impacts for P0, P1, P2, P3. It wasn't in the original 2023 RFP, as I understand. And the paragraph underneath that table says these results indicate portfolios P1, P2, and P3 are expected to have much greater impacts on residential customer bills over the near-term periods through 2033 and through 2038 compared to portfolio P0. So, they say they got this information from you guys and developed this table and looked at annual percentages. Do you dispute these percentages or impacts?
No, Commissioner, I'm not.
Okay. A couple other questions and nothing to do with that, I don't think. And I think Commissioner Carolee Williams, she was talking about the DEP-DEC merger. And I know there's some level of inter-system sales from DEP to DEC. Does that negatively affect customers in any way? I mean, is DEP customers?
It's a win-win.
Okay.
So they only sell if it's saving more costs, and then they share the savings. So it's a win-win for both customers through what's called the joint dispatch agreement.
That's what I wanted to know. So DEP customers would be glad to hear that, right?
Yeah.
Good. And I appreciate your candor. Finally, I can't remember who asked you the question, Mr. Quinto, about the PPAs and the utility owned. And I promise you, I listened intently, but you lost me. I just couldn't follow it. So I'm gonna try to ask it another way and see if you can simplify it. I mean, it's really gotta be simple for me too. Like modeling the PPAs versus the utility-owned solar. Does the model, the inputs, whatever, consider all cost of generation? In other words, if it's utility-owned, does it consider the capital cost, O&M, weighted average cost of capital, rate of return, and the PPA, it considers whatever that avoided cost would be?
So
I see Mr. Snyder shaking his head. So
I'll give it a shot, and Mr. Schneider can certainly jump in. The important thing is the same cost assumption that we used when we modeled a quote unquote utility owned or company owned project. That underlying cost, whether it's the capital cost, the operating cost, the operations, it's generation profile, ability to turn up, turn down. It's the same. It's essentially the same resource. The only thing is we've taken all those costs, same financing, return on equity, decommissioning costs at the end of the life, and turn that total cost number into a levelized cost of energy. So it just reformed that number so that the model is essentially seeing that cost differently annually over time. But if you were to take them all up, add them, present value them back to the same time, they would be equal. So they are the same resource, the same operations, the same value, the same cost. It's just how we're representing that cost. And that's why we don't feel that it's appropriate to do this, because you're spending a lot of time and resources trying to distinguish, should I account for it one way or another way, when what we think is more prudent and what I think the original intent of this was to identify if there's lower cost solar or in general resources were a different cost, does that change the selection of the resource? And what we found is that over the long period of time through 2050, it really didn't change the selection of resources on a cumulative basis, which further confirms that our this accounting difference is merely an accounting difference and not a significant value one way or the other to customers.
all right, and as that would relate to the process, whether the CPRE process or whatever, when I guess you have the third party evaluate, is that considered the same way? Looking at if it's utility owned, all those particular costs versus the PPA and the avoided cost and negotiated cost or whatever it is that evaluated the same way as in what Mr. Quinto just
I'm not the expert on that, Commissioner, but I do know they do look at the total cost, like the third-party independent evaluator will look at total cost of both, whether it's PPA or whether it's utility-owned. It's total cost of one project versus the other, including all operating costs, return on. I think importantly, if you think about that CPRE, and you guys have been through that, I was not in that particular proceeding. I've been threatened to be drug into that. But there's a range, you get a range of bids, right? There isn't a price for a PPA. You get 20 PPA prices, and you have a bunch of utility projects, and they're different prices. And so in my world, if you want to have a now I've got to have a generic PPA price that's somehow the average of all these PPAs that might be available in the Carolinas based on one or two procurements, and some average utility-owned price, and I don't get an average, I get a range for both. If I put it in the model, if I had a generic, and it's the same resource, that's the whole thing that makes it difficult in planning spaces. I'm taking the same resource, and where they're trying to go is say, well, this one has a cheaper cost of capital, this one's more expensive, therefore the model's always going to pick if I put in two generic resources, one PPA, one utility owned, it's not going to pick a mix of each because they want it done unconstrained. So now it's just going to say if one is a penny cheaper in the model, it's give me all of that penny cheaper one and not any of the other one because I can save that penny. The IRP is not meant to determine how should I finance solar through PPAs or through a depreciated rate base, right? And that's what it would turn into if you said, let's model both. We would turn some of those debates, what are the modelable benefits and what are the non-modelable? And you probably heard a lot of that in your CPRE docket. There's things that are outside the model, what can you replicate in a contract and end of life and terminal values and all of that. We don't generally get into that in an IRP. And when I pointed out on Friday that in the other jurisdiction, nobody did it that way, it's not because, they have a mandate or not. It's simply that's not a modeling practice that we generally see in IRP is to say, well, I could ask that of an SMR. What's the PPA price of an SMR versus the utility? That's a financing type issue when what we're trying to say is how much of a resource is needed and when. So solar versus wind, batteries, CT, CCs, SMRs, how much is needed and when and what volumes? That's the major intent of an IRP, not what should I own, what should the ownership structure be. To the extent the ownership structure has a price impact, you run price sensitivities on all of these. You do a high and a low and say, how much does that impact? But I think what we're trying to say is it's really difficult to come up with a generic PPA price and a generic ownership price and then put them both into the model because it will only yield one thing. It will give you whatever the cheaper is all day long. That doesn't mean that you should do, then the logical, well, see, you should only do utility owned or you should only do PPAs. That's not at all what that should be used for. But that's the result of trying to put them both in because you're modeling the same resource, just financed two different ways.
I think I understand that, and I hope you understand my main purpose for the questions or trying to understand it is ultimately, regardless whether it's utility owned, PPA, or whatever, I suspect the customer's only interested in what is in their best interest and what is the least cost. Does that sound reasonable?
It does.
I have no more questions. Thank you, gentlemen. You've been very patient.
Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. I just have a few questions in there for you, Mr. Snyder, and I think that they are hopefully yes or no type answers. So let's talk about the relationship between the IRP and other proceedings. So first of all, rate case filings. Is there enough evidence in this IRP filing and or the near-term action plan to approve any asset for recovery in a rate case?
Not in it's necessary. I would say IRP is necessary but not sufficient for a rate case.
Okay. And is there enough evidence in this proceeding to approve any asset under the Siting Act?
Commissioner Thomas, I think I'd have the same answer. It would be necessary piece of information in the Siting Act, but you would have other questions that are not in evidence in this as part of your Siting Act review. So it would be a necessary but not fully sufficient for a Siting Act.
All right. And is there enough evidence in the IRP or the near-term action plan to approve any asset for recovery in a rate case because it is selected under the CPRE process?
Same response, sir. I think this would provide useful information, but not fully sufficient for what would be determined in that rate case.
All right. And because an asset is included in this IRP and to select it in a CPRE filing, is there enough evidence to bypass any of the requirements of the Siting Act?
No, sir.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chair, I have one last question, and I hate that,
One more.
but I don't want to leave anything to speculation or wonder. So, Mr. Snyder, Commissioner Caston asked you about rate impact or bill impact as calculated by ORS based on information you all turned over to them. And I'm not looking, I can't remember the name of the table, but he referenced a table that specifically, I remember reading it. Oh, my colleague has it for me. I'm looking at Exhibit JFS-1, page 127 of 155. Are you table 45?
We're there.
Okay. So my understanding of this table is that P1 through 3, P1, P2, P3 have a much greater impact on bills than P0. Is that true?
Yeah, I think much is any rate impact is important to consider. So I know I'm not saying it's not something we should consider, but the absolute cheapest thing is just don't do anything. Like don't build anything, right? As you start to build, you're going to have a rate impact from that building, and then as you start meeting your balancing objectives, because the balancing objectives in the South Carolina statute didn't say least cost. They said least cost along with 6 other balancing factors. And by definition, achieving other balancing factors to the extent they are a constraint are going to have an impact on cost. So diversity of resources, having protection against commodity price risk. So for example, P0, this is on base assumptions on commodity prices and no, for the life of this plan, no carbon pricing whatsoever. And so under base assumptions, it's the cheapest. It can be the most expensive in a high gas price world or in a world where carbon has a price. And that's what the Minimax showed. So it is the cheapest if you're willing to trade off all the other 6 balancing factors. So when ORS said the porridge was too cold on P0, I think even ORS was saying that P0 exposes customers to the highest commodity risk, the highest carbon risk, the highest future legal regulatory risk of federal law continuing in the direction it's going. And so, yes, on this table, where none of the other balancing factors are taken into consideration, none of the risks of any things I just mentioned are taken into consideration, this would produce a cheaper bill. But it's almost like the cheapest way to own my house is don't have any insurance. I could save several $1,000s a year by not having insurance, yet I buy insurance for my home. So it is not my least cost path to home ownership, but I think it's the most prudent, least cost, least risk when I make that decision. And so I think that's what's in front of the commission is you could achieve a lower cost if you're willing to forego the other balancing factors.
All right, thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any redirect?
Mr. Chair, we do have probably about 10 minutes of redirect, so we can go to that now if that pleases the chair.
You said how much?
About 10 minutes, I'd expect.
Okay. Why don't we break till about 5 after 2? Maybe some people got lunch, we didn't, and we'll come back then with the redirect.
That'll be fine. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Burns?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted you to know that I have an appointment at 2 that I have to leave for, but Mr. Witt will be here to take care of CCBA's interests.
Well, then you're in good hands.
Okay, thank you, sir.
All right, adjourn.